All rise, veuillez vous lever. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience de la Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Good morning, Madam President. This is a situation in Libya in the case of the prosecutor versus Khalid Mohammed Ali El-Hishri. Case reference ICC 0111-0125, and for the record, we are in open session.
Merci.
Judge Motok, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome all those who are here, present both inside and outside of the courtroom. I will now ask the parties and participants to introduce themselves, beginning with you, Madam Deputy Prosecutor. Microphone.
Today, the Office of the Prosecutor is represented by myself, Nazat Shamim Khan, Deputy Prosecutor, and Nicole Sampson, Senior Trial Lawyer, Trial Lawyers Hisham Murad, Diane Looping, and Renz van der Werf, Jessica Lacey, Case Manager, and that is the team for the prosecution. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I shall now turn towards counsel for the defense. You have the floor.
Monsieur le Conseil de la Défense, la parole.
Counsel for defense.
Thank you, Madam President. The defense team for Khalid Al-Hishri is composed of myself, Khalid, Yasser, the lead counsel, Ian Edwards, Emma, Ahmed Al-Ammar, Islam Al-Hadidi, Miriam Waheba, and Aya Murad. Thank you, Madam President. Apologies, and we have also our intern, Julia, who is the first time, whose first time to attend in the ICC courtroom.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, counsel. I now call on the legal representatives of the victims to introduce themselves.
Les victimes sont représentées par Paulina Massida, conseil principal, Tart von Litzenborg, Ahmad Issa, Anna Peña et moi-même, Sarah Pellet, conseil au bureau du Conseil public pour les victimes.
Merci beaucoup, Maître Pellet.
Thank you very much, Madame Pele. As for the chamber, you have George Rain, Adelaide Sophie Alapini Gaunsu to my left, George Maria del Socorro Flores Liera. My name is Julia Antoanella Motok, and I am the presiding judge of Pre-Trial Chamber 1. Today marks the commencement of the hearing relating to the confirmation of charges brought by the prosecution against Mr. El-Hishri. In accordance with the program outlined in our scheduling order of the last 28th April, document number 106, this hearing shall take place over a period of 3 days, in the course of which we shall entertain the oral submissions of the prosecutor, the common legal representatives of victims, as well as those of the defense team of Mr. El-Hishri. At this stage of the proceedings, the role of the judges is to determine whether there is sufficient evidence to establish substantial grounds to believe that Mr. El-Hishri committed each of the crimes charged against him. In the event that one or several of the charges are confirmed, the pretrial chamber shall refer the case for trial according to the procedure. In such an eventuality, the general principles applicable to the hearing of this week shall be as follows. First of all, and this is important, Mr. El Hishri is presumed to be innocent insofar as his guilt has not been proven before the court. Furthermore, the burden of proof shall rest with the prosecution, which is required to produce sufficient evidence to prove the charges against Mr. El Hishri consistent with the standards set out in Article 61, paragraph 7 of the Rome Statute. Lastly, for the purposes of his defense, the suspect shall benefit from the rights set out in Article 61, paragraph 6 and Article 67 of the Rome Statute. I will now ask the court officer to read out the charges. Let me recall here that the entirety of the document containing the charges is accessible to the public on the internet site of the court, and that our court officer shall read out only an abridged version of that DCC. You have the floor, Mr. Court Officer.
The prosecution charges Mr. Khaled Mohammed Ali El Hishri, also known as Khaled Al Buti or Sheikh Khaled, with 17 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed between the 1st of May 2014 and 30th of June 2020 in Tripoli, Libya, against Mitiga prison detainees or persons otherwise in the custody or control of the perpetrators of the crimes at Mitiga prison, now described simply as the Mitiga perpetrators. Mr. El Hishri was a senior member or associate of a group commonly known as the Special Deterrence Force, or RADA, led by Abdel Rauf Kara. This group came to assume significant power and influence in Tripoli, including by later receiving an official mandate as the deterrence apparatus for combating organized crime and terrorism, or DACOT. At all the times relevant to the charges, Kara and SDF RADA controlled a strategically important area of Tripoli known as the Mitiga compound, which included a prison facility, Mitiga prison, holding thousands of prisoners. The prison was under the de facto control of Kara and other senior SDF RADA members or associates. While some of these persons may also have held ranks or affiliations with Libyan state institutions, this did not change the de facto control exercised by Kara and those close to him. Under Kara's authority, Mr. El Hishri was in a position to exercise general authority and influence throughout Mitiga prison from 2014 to 2020, and had direct control over the women's section and the persons detained therein. In that position, he personally committed numerous violent crimes, as well as participating in crimes committed by others. Specifically, Mr. El Hishri is charged with the following crimes under the Rome Statute. Counts 1 to 6. Crimes related to the violent and arbitrary arrests, detention, and systematic mistreatment of civilians and or fighters or de combat, including women and men, girls and boys, Libyans and non-Libyans, mainly at Mitiga prison, as follows. Count 1, imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty as a crime against humanity, concerning at least 945 detainees, pursuant to Article 7(1)(e) of the Rome Statute. Count 2, outrages upon personal dignity as a war crime, concerning at least 945 detainees, pursuant to Article 8(2)(c)(2). Count 3, cruel treatment as a war crime, concerning at least 945 detainees, pursuant to Article 8(2)(c)(1) of the Rome Statute. Counts 4 to 5, torture as a crime against humanity, and as a war crime concerning at least 945 detainees pursuant to Article 7(1)(f) and 8(2)(c)(1) of the Rome Statute. And count 6, other inhumane acts as a crime against humanity concerning at least 945 detainees pursuant to Article 7(1)(k). Counts 7 to 8. Rape concerning at least 10 detainees as a crime against humanity and as a war crime pursuant to Article 7(1)(g) and 8(2)(e)(6). Counts 9 to 10. Sexual violence concerning at least 49 detainees as a crime against humanity and as a war crime pursuant to Article 7(1)(g) and 8(2)(e)(6). The charged acts included forced nudity, counts 2 to 3, 6, and 9 to 10. Sexualized torture and invasive cavity searches, counts 2 to 10. Carried out in inappropriate and degrading conditions, and beyond what may be necessary for legitimate security reasons, including by or in front of other detainees, sometimes including relatives, members of the opposite sex, and children. Counts 11 to 12. Murder and attempted murder of at least 89 detainees as a war crime and crime against humanity pursuant to Article 7(1)(a) and 8(2)(c)(1) of the Rome Statute. The victims were either executed or otherwise killed immediately or died in the ordinary course of events resulting from acts of torture committed against them, or due to deliberate neglect and or the infliction of lethally inadequate conditions of detention. Count 13. Enslavement as a crime against humanity concerning at least 133 detainees pursuant to Article 7(1)(c) of the Rome Statute. These detainees, including Libyans, black migrants, mostly originating from East, West, Central, or Southern Africa, and other non-Libyans, were enslaved by Mitiga perpetrators who exercised ownership over them, severely deprived them of their liberty and their autonomy by controlling essentially every aspect of their lives. The enslaved detainees were deprived, for instance, of physical, psychological, sexual, and/or reproductive autonomy exceeding normal constraints within a prison system, including control or restrictions over their movement and physical environment, and unlawfully imprisoned, control over their sexuality, sexual and reproductive autonomy, sexual and gender identity, subjection to torture, cruel treatment, and abuse or coercion, psychological control and pressure or coercion, including controls over their religious and other beliefs, and by threats and harm to family members, forced labor, and subjecting detainees to servile status. Counts 14 to 17. Persecution as a crime against humanity, pursuant to Article 7(1)(h), on various grounds, with targeting on an intersectional basis, concerning at least 138 detainees, namely, count 14, persecution on political grounds of at least 17 detainees, especially Libyans, perceived to oppose the Mitiga perpetrators or their associated groups, and black migrants, targeted according to the perpetrators' purported objective to suppress so-called illegal immigration or illegal migrant trafficking. Count 15. Persecution on religious grounds of at least 14 detainees who were perceived as non-compliant with the perpetrators' ideological views and practices, including because they were perceived to profess other beliefs and or not to conform with certain practices, including with regard to prayer, dress, and or appearance, or otherwise by imposing Mitiga perpetrators' own ideological views and practices on their victims. Count 16, persecution on nationality, race, and or ethnicity, grounds of at least 47 detainees, primarily black migrants. And count 17, persecution on gender grounds of at least 60 detainees, comprising women and girls, actual and perceived LGBTQI+ persons, and men and boys subjected to sexual and or reproductive violence as a way to emasculate and subjugate them. The prosecution alleges that Mr. El-Hishri is individually criminally responsible for all of the above 17 counts, pursuant to Articles 25(3)(a), and additionally, and or alternatively, 25(3)(b), 25(3)(c), and 25(3)(d) of the statute, and seeks the confirmation of charges under all charged modes of liability. As such, Mr. El-Hishri is charged as follows. First, as a direct perpetrator, pursuant to Article 25(3)(a) of the Rome Statute. During the charged period, Mr. El-Hishri directly perpetrated all the crimes charged in counts 1 to 17 against Mitiga prison detainees and persons otherwise in the custody or control of the Mitiga perpetrators. This includes allegations that he personally raped and committed acts of sexual violence against Libyan women, and that he personally tortured, murdered, illegally imprisoned, persecuted, enslaved, and committed acts of cruel treatment and other inhumane acts against the detained men, women, and children, principally at Mitiga prison, but also at other locations in and around Tripoli. Second, as a direct and or indirect co-perpetrator, pursuant to Article 25(3)(a) of the Rome Statute. During the charged period, Mr. El-Hishri worked with others, including Abdel Rauf Kara, Dawit Nzam, and Osama Njim, to jointly carry out the crimes charged in counts 1 to 17 against Mitiga prison detainees and persons otherwise in the custody or control of the Mitiga perpetrators, principally at Mitiga prison. The co-perpetrators shared a common plan or agreement to exercise control through means such as punishment, coercion, and other forms of exploitation of persons in the Mitiga perpetrators' custody or control, principally at Mitiga prison, in pursuit of Mitiga perpetrators' interests or views and or those of its members. Mr. El-Hishri made an essential contribution to the commission of the common plan crimes by exercising general authority and influence through Mitiga prison, B, directly controlling the women's section of Mitiga prison, and C, directly committing the charged crimes. Third, as an indirect perpetrator, pursuant to Article 25(3)(a) of the Rome Statute. During the charged period, Mr. El-Hishri used Mitiga perpetrators with access to the women's section to ensure that the crimes charged in counts 1 to 17 would be committed against the women, girls, and young children detained therein. Fourth, additionally or alternatively, Mr. El-Hishri is charged with ordering and or inducing commission of the charged crimes pursuant to Article 25(3)(b) of the Rome Statutes, and or aiding and abetting or otherwise assisting the commission of the charged crimes pursuant to Article 25(3)(c) of the Rome Statute, and or contributing to the charged crimes committed by a group acting with a common purpose, pursuant to Article 25(3)d of the Rome Statute. Mr. El-Hishri committed the charged conduct with the required intent and knowledge for each mode of liability. Thank you, Your Honors.
Judge Motok.
Monsieur le greffier d'audience, un grand
A very big thank you to you, Mr. Court Officer. I also note that the suspect, Mr. El-Hishri, is present. Pursuant to paragraph 3 of the Rule 122 of the Rules of Procedure and Evidence, and before we come to the merits of the case, I would like to ask the parties if they wish to make any oral observations relating to the proper conduct of the proceedings prior to this hearing. I wish to recall that we received your filings, notably filings numbers 107 and 115, which we shall, of course, take into consideration. Accordingly, there is no need to rehash here those of your observations which are already in the case file. The same applies to the challenge to the jurisdiction of the court lodged by the defense under Article 19 of the statute, public filing number 108. In conformity with our scheduling order, the Chamber shall welcome the observations and responses concerning that challenge to jurisdiction in writing. It follows that any matters related thereto shall not form part of the agenda of the hearing scheduled for the days ahead. I will begin with the prosecution. Do you have any observations to make within the meaning of Rule 1223?
None from the prosecution, Madam President.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Prosecutor. And now to the defense counsel. Do you have any additional or complementary oral observations to make under Rule 1223?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Nous pouvons désormais passer.
Thank you, Madam President. We will stick to the assigned agenda.
Merci beaucoup. Nous pouvons
Thank you very much. We can now move to the opening statements. We will listen to the prosecutor, the representatives of the victims, and the defense after the break. I'll give the floor to the prosecution. You have the floor.
Madam President, honourable members of the bench, members of the Libyan and affected communities, and to those following these proceedings, today presents an important milestone in our collective pursuit of justice. The commencement of the confirmation of charges hearing against Mr. Khalid Mohammed Ali El-Hishri, known also as Khalid al-Bouti, is a testament to the tenacity of those most impacted by his crimes, to the courage and foresight of the international community in referring this situation to my office, and to the steadfast dedication of this court to investigate and prosecute those bearing responsibility for crimes committed in Libya, regardless of their power and influence. For 15 years, my office has had jurisdiction over the events in Libya and has diligently pursued its mandate as conferred on it by the United Nations Security Council. Despite a high number of active ICC warrants of arrest in the Libya situation, the arrest of Khalid El-Hishri and the commencement of these proceedings marks the first time that an individual will face justice before this court for crimes committed in Libya. This case conveys a clear message: no one is above the law, not even the most powerful. This confirmation of charges hearing is significant in bringing justice and accountability to thousands of his victims, including Libyan and non-Libyans, women and children. Khalid el-Hishri was able to act with impunity until his arrest in 2025. He and other leaders of the Special Deterrence Force, or SDF RADA, who controlled the Mitiga prison facilities, committed crimes without fear of punishment, consequences, or restrictions because of the security vacuum following the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, and because of the ongoing non-international armed conflict through which they amassed significant power and formidable resources. My office assesses that there have been no genuine criminal prosecutions in Libya for these crimes, despite reports by the United Nations of alleged abuses at Mitiga prison, and despite direct reporting by victims to Libyan law enforcement and prosecutorial authorities. Madam President, Your Honours, there are substantial grounds to believe that Khalid el-Hishri is criminally responsible for the charged war crimes and crimes against humanity. He and other senior leaders of the SDF RADA controlled the Mitiga prison compound, where the complete disregard for the rights and dignity of detainees was institutionalized to create a climate of terror. Khalid el-Hishri was widely known as a notorious torturer at the helm of Mitiga prison, one of the largest detention centers in Western Libya. Witness P 1046 described him as amongst the worst instigators of violence at Mitiga prison. Witness P 1031 referred to him as the angel of death. One of his preferred torture methods, as described by witnesses, was to shoot people, especially in the leg and knee. He would also hang people with their hands bound behind their backs and beat people with a shovel. His authority at Mitiga prison is amply demonstrated through the evidence. Witness P 644 describes the authority that Khalid el-Hishri held and the fear he inspired, stating that when he was at Mitiga prison, I quote, "You could hear the flies. This means everyone was quiet and fearful and the guards respectful." End of quote. Witness P 692 confirmed that people in the prison were afraid of Khalid el-Hishri because he always wore his gun and he was ready to execute people. Your Honours, this case is about enforcing the most fundamental limits on power, that those who detain others must do so lawfully and must protect them and their extreme vulnerability, and that when they do not, they are accountable under international law. As set out in the evidence, thousands of civilians in and around Tripoli were arrested and detained without lawful reason. Men, women, and children. Libyan nationals, non-Libyans, and black African migrants. Anyone could be arrested by SDF RADA and end up in Mitiga prison under their control, either because they were perceived as political opponents, enemies of the group or its allies, as migrants, or because their views or behavior conflicted with the group's beliefs, or merely because they had something that RADA wanted, be it money, properties, land, or information. Many were never told why they were arrested at all. Madam President, Your Honours, each and every one of the detained persons under the SDF RADA control at Matiga Prison and Compound are victims of the charged crimes. The abuse started upon arrest without proper charges. It worsened during detention. All those detained were subjected to unimaginable conditions of detention, including severe physical and mental suffering. Some cells were so overcrowded that detainees had to sleep on the ground in turns. Witnesses describe that they were so crammed together that they had to lie on their sides, packed so tightly that it felt that they were sleeping in a knife position. Other cells were so small that they contained only one detainee who could barely move, leading to muscle atrophy. Food was scarce, water had to be rationed. Facilities did not allow detainees to maintain basic hygiene. Illnesses festered in these unsanitary conditions. Khalid el-Hishri and other SDF RADA leaders and members weaponized these illnesses, which included tuberculosis, HIV, and various skin diseases, by placing the detainees whom they wanted to punish in cells where they were likely to be infected. Detainees were exposed to continuous, severe physical and psychological suffering. As set out in the evidence, witnesses described hearing, day and night, the screams of those being tortured. They witnessed other detainees being beaten and shot. They tended to dying cellmates who had been denied medical care. Continuous insults, taunting, and humiliation deepened the psychological suffering of the detainees. P. 1673 stated, and I quote, "I felt helpless and devastated. The psychological torment was worse than the physical pain. The humiliation left deep scars on my psyche." End of quote. P. 1026 reflected, and I quote, "I have never seen such horrible things. It is as if they were coming from another planet. They are not humans treating people that way. I think if in the future they were to catch me again, I would rather die than go back there." End of quote. Witness P. 486 likened being detained at Matiga to falling into a well with smooth walls, a well that you cannot get out of. Detainees were repeatedly and severely beaten during their incarceration, including sexualized acts of torture. Some detainees were left in such a bad state that they were transported back to their cell in a wheelbarrow. Others died as a direct result of the torture they endured. The women's section of Matiga Prison was under Khalid el-Hishri's direct control during the period of the charges. Witnesses described the abuses that Khalid el-Hishri and other Matiga perpetrators inflicted on these women. They were shot, whipped, suspended from the ceiling, dragged by their hair, raped, touched, and beaten until they bled. Their own children often witnessed the violence against them. The evidence also shows that minors were themselves beaten, tortured, shot, and raped. P. 943, a woman detained at the prison, described one of her interrogations, and I quote, "The interrogators cursed at me. They ripped my veil off during the interrogations and ordered me by saying, 'Talk, you dog.' In my culture, it is the end of a woman's life if a man takes off her veil against her will. It is very insulting for a man to do this. It showed that they could do anything they wanted with a female prisoner. I felt completely powerless and vulnerable. I felt like everything was over. I became completely depressed by these actions." End of quote. The evidence demonstrates widespread sexual violence against Libyans and non-Libyans alike, men, women, and children. Rape, the threat of rape, forced nudity, and beatings on reproductive organs, to name only a few such abuses, occurred regularly to detainees, irrespective of their age or gender, and sometimes because of it. As set out in our brief and in the evidence, and as you will hear further today, detained victims were enslaved and persecuted on multiple intersecting grounds. The detainees were also each the victim of not just one crime, but multiple crimes committed against them repeatedly throughout their detention. Witnesses recounted that Khalid el-Hishri committed some of these crimes himself. At other times, they were committed by his co-perpetrators and by associates over whom he exercised authority. These were not isolated acts of rogue Matiga prison guards. These crimes were deliberate, widespread, and systematic. The evidence shows that Khalid el-Hishri embodied and induced the behavior that he expected from all SDF RADA members and associates by killing, shooting, torturing, beating, insulting, and sexually assaulting detainees himself. He reprimanded the guards whom he deemed were too lenient. Witness P720 recounted that when a prison leader wanted to take detainees for a bit of exercise and sun, Khalid el-Hishri refused, stating, "What are you doing? You are trying to help them. We are trying to make them die." Witness P1736 was detained in the women's section of Matiga prison and recalls that one day Khalid el-Hishri brought in 2 young male detainees who appeared to have been severely beaten. He ordered the women not to give them any water or food, warning that if they did, the women would take their place and be punished. He told the 2 male detainees, and I quote, "You are not worth killing. You will die here." They did not survive. Witnesses described that this sense of powerlessness endured long after their release. Witness P872 explained, and I quote, "Because of what happened to me, I never feel safe and relaxed. I am always worried that they will come back and arrest me. I lost everything." End of quote. The impact extended far beyond the detainees themselves. Families suffered from years of separation. Witness 1046 stated, and I quote, "Talking about visits from my family makes me feel very emotional. I hardly saw them when I was in prison. My young children grew up when I was detained, and my adolescent boys, who had been adolescents when I was arrested, had beards when I was released." End of quote. Other witnesses recounted that their children no longer recognized them when they were released. Some of those who survived their detention at Matiga prison accepted to become witnesses in these proceedings, often at personal expense. Throughout the investigation, my office heard numerous witnesses recount their ordeal and describe its long-lasting impact. Their lives were shattered by their unlawful imprisonment and abuse at Matiga prison. The abuse inflicted in detention permeated every aspect of the victims' lives, and it continues to haunt them long after their release. For them, the nightmare continues. Many are still suffering from permanent physical disabilities. Others are trying to recover from the psychological trauma resulting from years of detention and sustained abuse. Witness P. 1682 poignantly described the devastating impact of detention at Matiga prison on his life. And let me quote his words. "The arrest and torture were not just a fleeting incident that came and went. They were an earthquake that shattered everything I had believed to be stable in my life. Since that day, I have carried the weight of anxiety in my chest, as if even my own breath no longer belonged to me, as if safety had become a distant, unreachable idea. My relationships crumbled. My image was distorted in the eyes of others, and my career was destroyed without reason, simply because I was a victim at a time that does not recognize victims. The voices of the oppressed, the screams of the tortured, and the darkness of the cold cells still inhabit my mind and soul. I have not truly left the prison. My body left, but my spirit remained imprisoned within it. I carry those memories like a wound that will never heal, searching through this pain for justice, for a sense of fairness, for a light that could dispel the darkness they planted in my depths. The arrest did not only take my freedom temporarily, it stole years from my life and left scars that continue to bleed silently to this day." End of quote. Abuse continues to define the lives of those still detained at Matiga prison. Accountability and the right to truth are mutually reinforcing pillars of international justice. In cases of unlawful detention and abuse, accountability serves not only punitive purposes, but also vindicates the victim's right to know the fate of detainees, the circumstances that enabled the crimes, and the identity of those responsible. The need for accountability in this case is exemplified by the words of witness P. 1736. Khalid el-Hishri tortured and raped her while she was detained at Matiga prison. During her detention, she told him that one day she would face him and seek justice for the wrongs he committed against her. During an interview with my office, she declared, and I quote, "I will be reborn when justice is achieved." End of quote. Madam President, Your Honours, the independent and impartial justice that this court can deliver is a beacon of hope for victims. These crimes must end and must not recur. I would like to express my gratitude to the victims, the witnesses, and the civil society organizations who displayed patience, resilience, and a resolute belief in justice despite the passage of time and the apparent obstacles in bringing this case to court. Madam President, I respectfully submit that this case should be committed to trial. To conclude the prosecution's opening remarks, my colleague, Mr. Hisham Murad, will now address the court in Arabic.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la procureure adjointe de Cannes. Nous passons maintenant aux déclarations liminaires.
Thank you very much. We now move to the legal representative of victims' submissions.
Ouais. Vous voulez continuer?
Would you like to continue? Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Your Honors, as the confirmation of charges hearing began today, the hopes of the victims lie in the proximity we are at now to achieve justice. This case covers 17 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including murder, torture, rape, physical violence, sexual violence, enslavement, persecution. These serious crimes occurred over the course of more than 6 years and targeted victims who were detainees in Metiga or who were under the control of the Rada force in Tripoli and its surroundings. As we shall show during the remarks on the merit during today's hearing and tomorrow, Khaled al-Hishri, along with others, such as Abdurrauf Kara, Usama Jaim, and others, established an institutionalized and systematic system of torture, enslavement, persecution, and control, in addition to other serious violations that are not only breaches of the law, but also violate the most basic and fundamental human values recognized by all mankind and which cannot be justified by any religion, reason, or conscience. What makes these crimes worse, possibly, is the fact that the perpetrators claimed commission of such crimes in the name of religion, when religion is innocent of such claims. These crimes have affected thousands of victims, including men, women, and the elderly. Even children were not spared from the gravity of these crimes. Some were direct victims of these crimes. Others were forced to see the commission of such crimes committed against the people who were closest to them, their very own fathers, mothers, in complete powerlessness and defenselessness, leaving long-lasting scars for the remainder of their lives. These victims were multiple in nationality, but the majority of these victims were the children of the very same people that Mr. Khaled al-Hishri comes from, and those who were his associates in crime. The children of the dignified Libyan people, for whom we have utmost appreciation and respect, a people of rich history, proud and decent. It is very painful to see heinous crimes such as those crimes committed against the dignified children of this people. In this regard, I am reminded by something a witness said in an interview with representatives of the OTP. This person was describing the crime inflicted on them that shall not be erased by time. I quote, "Not a day passes in my life and in the life of my family without seeing the impact of my detention and the torture that happened to me while detained. The physical scars left by torture remain visible on parts of my body, reminding me every day of the pain, fear, and humiliation I was subjected to. As to the psychological impact, it is deep. I remember the beating and the torture constantly. I still see them beating me. I still smell the odor of the place where I was detained. These flashbacks come back to me constantly. The weight of those moments still accompanies me." Unquote. Your Honors, having shared this short quote from the witness with you, I'd like to see this opportunity to express the OTP's appreciation for this witness and for all witnesses who shouldered significant burdens and exposed themselves and their own families to great dangers in order to present statements to the court and to provide the needed evidence, thanks to which this case has reached this important stage of the proceedings. On behalf of the OTP, I'd like to say to those witnesses and to all victims that justice is closer today than before. Today, your voices are heard before this esteemed panel of judges of this court as it seeks to administer justice long sought for. Your Honors, with these brief remarks, I conclude the opening statements of the prosecution. Thank you very much.
Judge Mota, thank you very much. Mr. Morad. And now, we can now move to the opening statements of the legal representative of victims. And we have until 11:30. So, Ms. Pallet, over to you, madam. Ms. Pallet. Thank you very much, Your Honour. We might have to slip over from 11:30, but we'll do our very best to stick to the 45-minute allotted time. Your Honour, honourable members of the bench, we appear before you today on behalf of the 64 victims authorised to participate in these proceedings, and that's since the 11th of May last. These victims, civilians held in Mitiga prison, men and women of Libyan nationality, African migrants and other foreign nationals, experienced a hellish prison in which the law had no place and which was replaced by violence, coercion, and fear. We also appear, Your Honours, on behalf of their individual families, whose lives have been forever affected by the unlawful detention of their loved ones and or death of these latter. For some, this day has been 10 years in the coming. This hearing, far from being a straightforward formality, constitutes a crucial stage in understanding, or at least to attempt to understand, the unspeakable, thereby enabling their suffering to be at last recognized and for justice to be done on their behalf. For the majority of these people, understanding is key in trying to surmount these tragic events. It means, finally, making sense of their horrific experience by judicial recognition of the apparatus of violence and abuse involved, of individual responsibility, as well as clarifying the overall context. Without this level of understanding, the prejudice incurred will persist under a different guise, impinging on the victim's sense of dignity and a feeling of safety and closure. For many, like for victim A/0003/26, it's not only through recognition by the court and judicial truth that victims can begin to accept what they endured and start, as best they can, to heal. I quote, "I make this application both in the conviction that the International Criminal Court is the resort or last resort for victims when the national justice system is inoperative, and in the certainty that justice knows no temporal limit and that human dignity deserves protection and recognition." End of quote. The number of victims participating in these proceedings, Your Honours, is by no means indicative of the scale of victimization in this case. the participating victims make up a tiny proportion of all the victims affected by the crimes for which Mr. El-Hishri is a suspect. Indeed, a much larger number of victims was subjected to the same system of abuse. Not all have applied to participate before this court. Some reside in Libya or elsewhere, where conditions of safety and fear prevent them from coming forward. Others are unable to do so because of the trauma they endured, or because, sadly, they didn't survive the atrocious prison conditions and torture inflicted on them in Mitiga between 1st of May 2014 and 30th of June 2020. Their absence in no way undermines the reality of the facts, Your Honours, nor does it weaken the case before Your Honours. On the contrary, Madam President, honourable members of the bench, their absence casts light on the scale of the crimes committed in Mitiga and the large number of voices that have gone unheard. The victims' experience vary considerably. They do, however, converge upon an essential common reality, namely, Mitiga was a place where human beings were stripped of their dignity, exposed to systematic violence and abuse, and yielded up to the absolute power of those who controlled it, namely RADA. 4 distinct groups of victims emerge: Libyan nationals, non-Libyan detainees, women and their children, as well as the families of the detainees. Each group highlights a specific facet of the same system of detention and violence which shaped the reality of life at Mitiga and which attaches to the responsibility of this suspect as one of the main perpetrators. For every victim, their ordeal began upon their arrest. The circumstances of the arrests themselves reveal a pattern of persecution. The victims were apprehended suddenly at checkpoints, in their home, in their place of work, or in the street. Armed men appeared without warning. There was no judicial due process, no warrant, no legally grounded reasons. Instead, Your Honours, spurious accusations. In fact, numerous victims were singled out for their supposed political opinions, their presumed affiliations, or simply because of their geographical origins, their wealth, or their nationality, or their sexual orientation, genuine or supposed, or again, in order to apply pressure on their husband, their family, or their nearest and dearest. They were subsequently branded as traitors, terrorists, supporters of opposing groups to RADA or Daesh, apostates, or any other bogus label designed to justify their detention. Violence went systematically hand in hand with these arrests. They were part of a coercion apparatus designed to exercise immediate control, to shatter any resistance and instill fear even before the victims arrived at Mitiga. Accordingly, in many cases, victims were beaten upon capture, they were insulted, they were humiliated, and acted under duress even before their transfer to the prison. And Madam President, Your Honours, this initial violence was in no way peripheral. The victims were then taken to Mitiga, where they were held without any legal basis. I've said this, without any judicial process, and therefore with no genuine means to challenge their detention. They were totally subjected to the will of those who controlled the facility, namely the members of RADA, among whom Mr. al-Hishri. Numerous families didn't even know where their loved ones were held or whether they were still alive, but we shall return to this point, Your Honours. The instant they arrived at Mitiga, the victims were confronted with conditions which beggared belief, marked by systematic violence and abuse, extreme hardship, and a relentless atmosphere of fear and humiliation. Some were even placed in solitary confinement in cells so small that any movement was nigh on impossible. These were not spaces designed to house human beings, and yet people were held there for long periods. Other victims were held in larger cells, but which were nonetheless areas of extreme suffering. These areas were overcrowded, housing dozens of detainees. Sometimes more than 80 men would occupy a single cell. There wasn't enough room to lie down. Prisoners had to sleep in what they themselves describe as the knife position, namely lying on one side, tightly packed against each other, their bodies in rows. The slightest movement required everybody to move as one. When a prisoner turned over, everyone had to turn over at exactly the same time. Even sleep was a rare privilege. Some detainees could only rest for a few hours at a time, while others had to stay standing for long periods, for want of enough space for everyone to lie down at the same time. Inside these cells, an internal pecking order appeared. Prisoners who'd been incarcerated the longest would appropriate what little space was available along the walls. New arrivals would be relegated to the middle of the cell, or next to the so-called toilets, used by dozens of detainees without a shred of privacy or suitable sanitation. Here again, access had to be organized, and these conditions were described by victim A/00023/ in these terms, I quote, You had to queue to go to the toilet, and you could only actually get there after 40 or so other detainees had been there before you, making it very difficult to manage your most basic bodily needs. So we developed health conditions like constipation, hemorrhoids, and urinary infections, unable to relieve ourselves when we had to. We had to sleep standing up, swapping over every 6 hours to get a place to lie down in. The allotted space for each prisoner was never greater than the span of a single stride or 1.5 strides, which brought on varicose veins due to our standing position for long periods, end of quote. There was no ventilation. Lighting was minimal, even totally absent. It was stifling. Food was inadequate, both in quantity and in quality. Hunger was a constant. Access to water was severely restricted. As stated by victim A/00004/26, and I quote, In the prison, conditions were extremely bad. I lost more than 45 kilos for lack of food, malnutrition, and overcrowding in the cells. There were more than 42 of us crammed into a cramped cell. I suffered from scabies, a constant itchiness throughout the entire time I was imprisoned. And despite my repeated requests, I never received treatment or medicine. End of quote. Madam President, Your Honours, for the victims, time lost all meaning. Day melted into night, and night into day. Some had been held for months, others for years. None knew when or if they would ever regain their freedom, or whether their imprisonment would one day come to an end. But the conditions of detention were only a part of the system set up by RADA. Violence at Mitiga was a daily occurrence. Prisoners were regularly removed from their cells for interrogation, where questions weren't to establish the truth, but to break people's will. As my learned friend from the prosecution, the deputy prosecutor, stated, victims reported blows, being hanged on hooks, electrocution, forced into contorted body positions, and repeated acts of humiliation. They heard the cries of other detainees. They saw some return injured or mentally wrecked. And they've witnessed people leaving, but never to return. These methods of torture were used routinely as part of an apparatus of abuse, both systematic and deliberate. In addition to physical violence, unrelenting psychological cruelty was used at Mitiga. Detainees were insulted, derided, often in terms directed against their families. Their suffering was mocked, their calls for help ignored, their humanity constantly negated. Some prisoners died from the after effects of torture. Others succumbed to the cumulative effects of custody, injuries, illness, and neglect, Madam President, Your Honours. Victim A/00014/26 described the situation as follows, and let me quote. Sometimes torture involved stubbing out cigarettes on our bodies. We were also hung up by our wrists above our heads. The process was extremely hard. Food was systematically limited, reduced to the daily ration of a small piece of bread and a litre of water. In winter, we were left with no clothes or heating, and in summer, no air conditioning. Skin disease spread, leaving lasting marks on my back. Tuberculosis also spread, affecting 10 people who all died. End of quote. Beyond the physical violence meted out daily and during interrogations, victims describe omnipresent sexual violence at Mitiga. Detainees were subjected to rape and other forms of sexual violence as part of the same system of coercion, punishment, and control. Victims describe how these forms of violence were used to humiliate, dehumanize, and break the will of detainees. These acts came with threats, insults, and in an environment in which any scope for resistance was systematically crushed. Madam President, Your Honours, for women prisoners, there was a constant risk of sexual violence, and their detention made them acutely more vulnerable, held in a separate area of the prison. They were at the mercy of those controlling access to their cells. Detainees held in neighboring sections could hear the women's cries. These cries went through walls and contributed to establishing a climate of fear and powerlessness throughout all of Mitiga prison. Sexual violence was therefore neither kept secret nor isolated. It was known. It was an integral part of the prison environment. And as with other forms of violence and abuse, it was part of a system where power was exercised without limit, but with total impunity. Indeed, Madam President, Your Honours, the experience of women detainees in Mitiga reveals an additional layer of cruelty within this system of abuse. It was a place where women's bodies, their dignity, and their identity were, as such, deliberately targeted. The women's section came entirely under this suspect's control. Victims constantly describe him as having sole authority over that section. Only he had the keys. Only he opened the doors. Nobody went in without his knowledge and his approval. Nothing happened in the women's section without his consent, without the consent of Mr. El-Hishri. And this absolute control placed each female detainee in a position of total dependency on the suspect. Even their most basic needs, sanitary towels, medical care, access to the outside air, religious materials, or simply being able to leave their cell, was left up to him. Pregnant women and women giving birth were refused medical care, even urgent. Newborn infants died for lack of medical assistance. Other women were in custody with their young children, children who witnessed the violence inflicted on their mother. But it was the bodily violence and the outrages upon women's dignity which both left the profoundest mark on these women's experience, Your Honours. And in addition to the physical violence, they suffered humiliation deliberately directed against them as women. For numerous victims, this humiliation had upon them a more devastating effect than the blows themselves. Their breasts, their buttocks, and their genitals were deliberately touched under the pretext of a body search or movement to another location. Other victims report having been totally undressed under a hail of abusive language such as whore, animal, bitch, or bitch seed. Their headscarves were torn off during interrogations, a deeply humiliating and symbolically violent act, particularly connotated in the cultural and religious context in Libya, as the Deputy Prosecutor reminded us of a moment ago. The women report that these experiences left them with a feeling that their lives were broken and that they'd lost their honor, their family status, and in some cases their future. This is important in Libyan society, where imprisoning a woman is enough in and of itself to produce deep and long-lasting stigma. The mere suspicion of rape can lead to being rejected by one's family and put an end to any prospect of marriage or social integration. Several women stated having lived in a permanent state of fear of falling victim to sexual violence, a fear which, for some, sadly, materialized. Indeed, some victims describe rape, sexual assault, and repeated sexual harassment inside Mitiga's walls. Some offer accounts of being assaulted directly by Mr. El-Hishri, including the threat of a firearm. They describe forced nudity, anal penetration, and sexual contact, accompanied by degrading insults and death threats. Other women of varying nationalities were repeatedly raped, some becoming pregnant and compelled to undergo abortions. Madam President, Your Honours, this atmosphere of fear was a constant. At Mitiga, the mere sound of keys in the corridor was enough to trigger panic. That sound, however innocuous, signaled for these women that Khaled al-Hishri was approaching. Victims describe him not only as a guard or an administrator, they describe him as the very embodiment of the terror that reigned in the women's section, a man whose voice, whose footfalls, and whose jangling keys were enough to reduce an entire cell to silence. For many women, their trauma wasn't over when they were released. Their trauma's consequences lives on in their body, in their mental health, in their ability to conceive children, and in the way they're seen in their families and their communities. Some women have reported lasting infertility, chronic pain, panic attacks, persistent shame associated with the stigma of prison and sexual violence. For these women, Mitiga hasn't been left behind in the prison. Mitiga continues day in, day out. But, Madam President, Your Honours, it's essential at this stage to emphasise that the suspect wasn't a remote commander. He was there. He was visible. He was known. And he was perfectly described by the victims. He's described as one of the most feared torturers in the entire prison, a man who had power of life or death over every single Mitiga detainee, and not only women. Madam President, I'd now like to hand over to Counsel Masida for the continuance of our opening statements. Thank you. Judge Motorok. Thank you very much, Ms. Pellets. Ms. Masida, you have the floor. Madame Pasida, thank you very much. My submissions will take 20 minutes or so, so I call upon your indulgence to complete in this block. Judge Motorok, you can have the time that you require.
Your Honors, alongside Libya's detainees, migrants were also held within Mitiga. The accounts of the victims demonstrate that the suffering of migrants is not accidental. It is the result of structures of abuse, militia control, and international complicity that allowed Mitiga and other detention facilities in Libya to operate with impunity for years. Many migrants had already endured violent interception at sea by the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, only to be returned to Libya against their will and immediately detained. They believed they had already survived the worst. They had not. The experience of migrant victims cannot be understood as mere detention. It was a system of enslavement, a system in which those in control exercised power akin to ownership. In the words of A/00043/26, I quote, "I didn't just feel like a slave. They called us slaves. That's all they called us. They didn't use our names, just referred to us as slaves. It was used to insult and humiliate us as much as possible." End of quote. Migrants were placed at the very bottom of the hierarchy at Mitiga. They were treated as disposable. A/00033/26 26 explains, I quote, "They limited our sleep because they needed us to work. They referred to us as slaves. If you told them your name, it didn't matter. They just say, 'Hey, you, slave,' and gave us orders," end of quote. Like other detainees, migrants were held in overcrowded, unsanitary, and degrading conditions, deprived of food and basic needs. But their treatment often went further. They were subject to stricter control, harsher punishment, and constant surveillance. Violence and threat enforced their detention. Escape was impossible. Resistance brought immediate and severe consequences. What most clearly distinguished the experience of migrants' victims is the systematic exploitation of their labor. Migrants were forced to work, never voluntarily, always under coercion and fear. They were compelled to perform exhausting, degrading tasks. As A/00030/26 recalls, I quote, "Feeling like a slave every day, being beaten and being forced against my will to do hard labor was degrading, and I felt helpless," end of quote. They cleaned cells and facilities in unsanitary conditions, transported heavy goods, carried out construction work, and performed duties that placed them in direct proximity to the violence perpetrated at Mitiga. A/00043/26 describe the relentless nature of this exploitation in these words, I quote, "They made us work continuously. We worked from around 6 a.m. until the early evening, like around 6 p.m. Then we'd rest for 1 or 2 hours. And then they come and made us work again until the early hours of the morning. Then we'd rest again for 1 or 2 hours. They only gave us these short breaks to keep us alive, so they could keep us working more," end of quote. Migrants were also compelled to assist in the abuse of other detainees. Forced to facilitate strip searches, to restrain detainees during interrogation, or to escort them to torture site. Some were made to supervise, guard, or discipline other detainees, placed in position of authority under coercion, transforming victims into instruments of the system. Your Honor, this was not incidental. It was integral to how the system functioned, using one group of victims to control and harm another. Migrants, like other detainees, were subjected to forms of control that were deeply sexualized, gendered, and degrading. They were forced to undergo invasive body searches. They were stripped, exposed, humiliated. They were subject to sexual violence, sexualized torture, and threat of rape, including violence targeting intimate parts of the body, their reproductive autonomy, and pregnant women. Sexual violence was not separate from the system of enslavement, it was part of it. It reinforced domination, submission, and the complete denial of autonomy, protection, and rights. Psychological control was equally pervasive. Migrants faced constant threat against themselves and their families. They were insulted, dehumanized, and reduced to derogatory stereotypes. Fear shaped every aspect of daily life, reinforced by violence, humiliation, and the suffering they witnessed around them. The system also operated through coercion disguised as choice. Some migrants were offered appearance privileges, slightly better conditions, reduced violence, minor advantages in exchange for compliance. But these were not real choices. They existed within a context where refusal meant punishment and survival depended on submission. What emerged from the account of migrant victims is not a collection of isolated acts, it is a system. A system in which migrants were targeted because of who they were, because of their nationality, their skin color, their perceived status. A system in which they were assigned the most dangerous, degrading, and violent roles. A system in which their vulnerabilities was exploited at every level. For these victims, Mitiga was not only a place of suffering. It was a place where their labor was exploited, their bodies controlled, and their dignity denied, where they were made to exist for the benefit, the power, and the violence of others. Madam President, Your Honors, the suffering caused by what happened in Mitiga did not end at the prison gates. It extended into families, into homes, and into the daily lives of those who were left behind. Families of detainees lived in a state of constant uncertainty. When their relatives were arrested, they were not told where they had been taken. For days, weeks, sometimes months, families searched desperately for answers about the fate of their loved ones. A/00027/26 described this ordeal with these words, I quote, "After their kidnapping by the Rada militiamen, we did not know where they were, and we looked for them everywhere for a long time until we finally learned they were in Mitiga. Not knowing where they were was unbearable," end of quote. Even when detainees were eventually located, contact remained severely restricted. Visits, when permitted at all, were often conducted by video, delayed without explanation, or suspended entirely for long periods. During these silences, families lived with one single overwhelming fear, that their loved one had died. A/00019/26 explains, I quote, "We were consumed by fear, believing he had died in detention. Even when contact was allowed, it was not in person. It was conducted via camera and the screen. He appeared in a terrible condition, severely emaciated in a frightening way," end of quote. This uncertainty became a form of suffering in itself. Children grow up not knowing whether their fathers were alive. Mothers waited without answers. Families lived suspended between hope and despair. The economic consequences were devastating. In many households, the detained person was the primary provider. Their sudden disappearance plunged families into financial hardship. Families were forced to sell property, businesses, and personal belongings simply to survive. Children were forced to stop attending school because their families could no longer afford the costs of education. As a result, opportunities were lost, futures were permanently altered. The social consequences were equally severe. A/00050/26 recounts, I quote, "We were unable to find him. or to know his whereabouts for a long time, which was extremely difficult for the entire family. I was very worried about him because I could not visit him and I had no news about him, which caused so much stress. They took our money, our happiness. Why? Why would they bring us such injustice? They left us with nothing except for constant pain and fear. End of quote. Children of detainees like A/0003726 were bullied and stigmatized. Families faced pressure, intimidation, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. They felt watched, vulnerable, and exposed. Some families learned, often indirectly, that a loved one had died in detention. They were denied the opportunity to say goodbye, denied even the dignity of seeing them one last time. And even when detainees were eventually released, the suffering did not end. They returned weakened, often seriously ill or with permanent disabilities, bearing the visible and invisible scars of months, often of years of detention, torture, and neglect. Their families then carried a new burden: the cost of medical treatment, weight of trauma, and the realization that life would not seem to return to what it had been. A/00009/26 describes, I quote, "In the first period after my release, I was overwhelmed by fear and unable to return to my normal life. I stayed at home and did not dare to go out alone. I was always accompanied by my mother because I was afraid of being abducted again." End of quote. For many families, the damage is lasting. A/00053/26 was excluded from her family because of her husband's detention. She explains, I quote, "I lost my life, I lost my job, I lost my friends, my family, and I am in constant fear because of what happened to my husband. I also lost the possibility of being a mother because he became completely infertile as a result of events he underwent in Mitiga." End of quote. These families continue to live with fear, particularly in a context where some responsible for the detention remain present and influential. They continue to experience anxiety, insecurity, and the lingering effects of years of uncertainty, hardship, and stigmatizations. These families are also victims. They suffer not only because of what was done to their loved ones, but because of what that loss, that absence, and that uncertainty did to their lives. These victims seek recognition of that suffering, recognition that the crimes committed in Mitiga extended beyond the walls of a prison, and they too seek justice. Madam President, Your Honors, the harm suffered by all victims is profound and enduring. Many continue to live with physical injuries, damaged limbs, chronic pain, untreated wounds, permanent disabilities. Others carry psychological trauma, nightmares, anxiety, and the fear that persists long after their release. Their lives have been fundamentally altered. Families have been broken, livelihoods lost, futures disrupted. For victims, the experience of Mitiga did not end with their release. It continues every day in memory, in fear, and in the struggle to rebuild their lives. And yet, despite all that I've endured, they have chosen to come before this court. all the victims participate in these proceedings because they want the truth to be known, because they want what happened inside Mitiga to be recognized for what it was, a system of crimes. They seek accountability for those who ordered, enabled, and carried out these acts. They seek acknowledgement that their suffering mattered, and they seek justice, not only for themselves, but for those who did not survive, for those whose voices can no longer be heard, and those who still wait for freedom. Madam President, Your Honors, today's hearing marks a historic moment. 1 year ago, victims felt utterly abandoned, forced to watch Mr. Osama Niem evade surrender to the court and then be repatriated, a sequence of events that struck them as a profound betrayal of their pursuit of justice. Today, they see a long closed door cracking open again, and with it, the first real sign that justice may finally begin to move towards them rather than away. This case marks a moment of profound consequence, not only for the suspect, not only for the victims, but for the enduring principle that law must triumph over violence and that human dignity must prevail over fear. For years, the walls of Mitiga concealed suffering. They concealed torture, humiliation, exploitation, and the destruction of human lives. But today, in this courtroom, those walls no longer shield the truth. The victims have brought the truth before you. They have carried it with courage, with dignity, and with a determination that no system of abuse could silence or destroy. This case matters because it affirms that even where the rule of law has collapsed, the reach of justice does not end. It matters because it tells every victim, Libyan, non-Libyan, migrant, man, woman, child, that their suffering is not invisible and their pain is not forgotten. It matters because it affirms that what was done to them was not fate, not misfortune, and not an inevitable consequence of conflict, but crime. And it matters because it sends a message far beyond this courtroom, that those who wield power to destroy lives will one day be called to account, that those who believe themselves beyond the reach of justice will one day stand where the suspect stands now, and that the voices of victims, silenced in cells and drowned out by violence, will ultimately be heard loud and clear in a court of law. Madam President, Your Honors, this is why victims are here, enduring the pain of remembrance, not for vengeance, but for recognition, for accountability, for justice. And today, they place their trust in this court and the promise that justice will be done. Your Honors, this concludes our submission in opening statement for the victims that we represent. We thank you very much.
Judge Martok. Thank you very much, Ms. Masida. As previously stated, we must now rise, and we shall resume at 1:30 this afternoon. Thanks to all.